The courtroom was thick with tension. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The buzz of murmurs faded as everyone sat in anticipation. This was no ordinary trial. The entire city seemed to be holding its collective breath as it waited for the final verdict. But no one could have predicted the twist that was about to unfold. At the center of it all, sitting in the defendant's chair, was Victor Blackwood, a man who seemed so confident in his fate, so sure that he would walk out of this courtroom a free man. His posture was immaculate, as though he were on display. The custom-tailored suit he wore was sharp, perfectly pressed, with every detail designed to communicate his wealth and power. His dark eyes scanned the room, cool and calculating, giving the impression that he had already won the battle. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth as he sat back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him as though he were the puppet master pulling the strings of everyone else in the room. His defense attorney stood beside him, the two of them the very image of invincibility. Victor Blackwood had every reason to feel this way. His lawyers had been doing a masterful job of poking holes in the prosecution's case, undermining every witness, questioning every piece of evidence. For weeks, the prosecution had struggled to find anything concrete to pin on him. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing that could directly link him to the scene of the crime. It was a robbery gone wrong, they said. An unfortunate accident. The victim, Sarah Morgan, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But David Morgan, Sarah's 8-year-old son, knew better. He had always trusted his instincts, and in this case, they screamed that something wasn't right. There was more to this than just a random act of violence. He had seen the way his mother had been, how kind and selfless she was. Who would want to hurt someone like that? Who would want to steal from someone so generous? The whole thing didn't make sense to him. David had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom for weeks, his small body pressed into the uncomfortable wooden chair, his eyes wide as he absorbed every word being said. For most of the trial, he had felt like a bystander, helpless and overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. But as he sat there now, he was no longer just the grieving little boy who had lost his mother. He was ready to do something about it. Today was the day that everything would change. David had spent countless hours over the past month searching for something, anything, that could prove Victor Blackwood's guilt. He had gone through his mother's belongings, piecing together fragments of the life they had shared, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had taken her from him. And then, one day, he had found it. It was just a small silver button, wedged between the seats in the back of his mother's car. The moment he found it, David had known it meant something. It was a clue, something that no one else had noticed. He didn't know how, but he could feel in his gut that this was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was something Blackwood had left behind, something he had never intended to be found. With that discovery, David's whole world shifted. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He had to speak up. He had to tell everyone what he had found. He couldn't let Blackwood get away with it. David stood up slowly, his little hands clenched tightly in front of him as he made his way to the front of the courtroom. His legs were shaky, and his heart raced in his chest. It felt like everyone in the room was watching him, their eyes burning into him. But he didn't look back. He couldn't. His grandmother had tried to stop him from coming to court every day, tried to protect him from the harsh reality of the trial. But David insisted. He had to be here. He had to find the courage to speak up for his mother. She would have done the same thing. She would have fought for him. When David reached the front, the judge, a stern but kind man, looked at him with curiosity. He adjusted his glasses, clearly confused. "David, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. David took a deep breath. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "I know he did it," he said, his words ringing out clear and strong, louder than anyone expected from a boy of his age. The room fell completely silent. Even Victor Blackwood, sitting confidently just a few feet away, froze for a moment, his smug smile faltering. His eyes widened in disbelief. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected David to speak up. The defense lawyer immediately jumped to his feet, ready to object, but the judge held up a hand, signaling for him to wait. "David," the judge said, his tone calm yet questioning, "what do you mean? What are you talking about?" David didn't falter. He pulled out the small silver button from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. The courtroom erupted in whispers. A button. That was it? David's voice cut through the chatter. "This button," he said, his voice growing stronger, "belongs to a suit worn by Victor Blackwood." The defense attorney snorted, rolling his eyes. "Objection! This is ridiculous. A child's imagination is—" The judge raised his hand again, silencing him. "Let the boy speak," he said, his voice firm. David looked around the room, locking eyes with the jury, and then with Blackwood himself. "I found this in my mother's car," he said. "It was stuck between the cushions in the back seat. And I looked it up. This is a specific kind of button. It belongs to a suit that only one person in this town wears." The murmurs grew louder, and David could see the unease spread across Blackwood's face. The defense lawyer was growing agitated, but the judge motioned for him to sit down. "I researched this," David continued, his heart pounding in his chest, "and I found pictures of Victor Blackwood wearing the exact same suit, the same kind of suit that has this button, the same button I found in my mother's car." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the prosecutor's eyes widened. The defense lawyer looked like he might faint. Victor Blackwood's confident demeanor had completely evaporated. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed rattled. His hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly, his knuckles turning white. The prosecutor flipped through the stack of photos in his file and found the one he was looking for. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. It was a photo of Blackwood at a business event, wearing the same expensive navy suit, missing a single silver button on the left sleeve. "This button," the prosecutor said, his voice steady, "places Victor Blackwood at the scene of the crime. It proves he was there. This is the evidence we've been waiting for." The courtroom buzzed with excitement, the tide of the trial shifting dramatically. Blackwood's defense attorney sputtered, trying to find words, but there was no longer any point in objecting. The truth had been exposed. David's legs were shaking, but he held himself upright. His grandmother's hand squeezed his, offering silent support. He had done it. He had spoken the truth, and in doing so, he had helped bring justice for his mother. But even as David sat down, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The way Blackwood was staring at him, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear, sent a cold shiver down David's spine. For the first time, David understood. Blackwood wasn't just angry. He was afraid. And that meant David wasn't safe. Not by a long shot. Before everything had gone wrong, David Morgan was just like any other 8-year-old boy. He spent his days filled with the simple joys of childhood, climbing trees, playing baseball with the neighborhood kids, and, on weekends, watching cartoons with his mother, Sarah. There was a lightness in his life that he often took for granted, a sense of peace that came from the steady love of his mother, who had been his rock, his guiding star. Sarah Morgan was a woman who seemed to have an endless capacity for love. As a nurse, she dedicated herself to her patients, always going the extra mile to make sure everyone felt cared for. But it wasn't just her patients who felt her love. David had been the center of Sarah's world. He was her only child, and she made sure he knew he was loved with every waking moment. Every night, before bed, Sarah would tuck David in with a kiss on the forehead and a gentle reminder. Remember, David, kindness is the most powerful thing you can offer. People will disappoint you. The world will sometimes seem cruel, but you must never stop being kind. It's the only way to stay strong in a world that's so unfair. David believed his mother's words. She was the kind of person who truly embodied everything she said. He had watched her for years, always helping others, whether it was holding someone's hand in the hospital or offering a kind word to someone who was down. Sarah made him feel safe, loved, and secure, and David had no reason to believe that the world could be any other way. But that sense of safety, that simple happiness, was shattered one rainy evening in early spring. It started as a typical evening. Sarah had worked her shift at the hospital, and as always, she promised David she would be home soon. David had grown used to his mother working late. It was part of their routine. After all, she was a nurse, and sometimes people needed help when others weren't around. But this time, something felt different. As the hours ticked by, David began to feel a tight knot of unease in his stomach. He watched the clock on the wall, its second hand ticking forward with slow, deliberate precision. 6:30 p.m. passed, then 7 p.m., and then 8 p.m. Still no sign of Sarah. David tried to call her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By 9 p.m., his worry had turned into anxiety, and he knew deep down something was wrong. Normally, when Sarah worked late, David's grandmother, who lived just down the street, would come over to keep him company. She would make sure David wasn't alone, watching movies and sharing stories until Sarah got home. But tonight, his grandmother wasn't there. David didn't understand why. All he knew was that his mom had promised to come home, and she hadn't. At around 10 p.m., the doorbell rang. David jumped up from his chair, hopeful that it was his mother finally coming home. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Sarah standing there. It was a police officer. The officer, a man in his 30s with a somber expression, looked down at David with kind but troubled eyes. He asked if David could sit with him for a moment, and that's when the truth hit him, hard and fast. His world tilted, and suddenly everything felt like it was falling apart. "David," the officer said gently, sitting down across from him, "I need you to listen very carefully. Your mom, she's been hurt." David didn't understand what he meant. What did he mean, hurt? His mother wasn't hurt. She was always strong, always smiling, always there when he needed her. But the officer's expression was serious, and David could see the sadness in his eyes. "She's gone, David," the officer continued softly. "We're doing everything we can to find out who did this, but we need to tell you the truth." His mind couldn't process the words. His heart beat so hard in his chest that it hurt. His mother, his beautiful, kind, loving mother, was gone. And he wasn't ready for it. No one could ever be ready for something like that. The officer explained that Sarah had been attacked in the hospital parking lot, just as she was about to leave her shift. She'd been approached by someone who had tried to rob her, take her purse, her car keys, maybe worse. It was a senseless act, one that made no sense. The officer couldn't tell him who had done it. They didn't have any suspects, but they were working on it. David's world crumbled around him. The mother who had tucked him in every night, who had made him lunch and sang him lullabies when he was scared, was never coming back. The thought was incomprehensible. His mind struggled to wrap around the idea that she was gone forever. The next few days were a blur of pain. The funeral was somber. His grandmother moved in with him, trying to provide comfort. But everything felt wrong. The house felt empty, without his mother's laughter, her stories, her warmth. David couldn't bring himself to talk, to eat, to do anything. His heart was heavy, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, smiling at him as she always did. But it wasn't real. She was gone. Days turned into weeks, and the police investigation moved slowly, methodically. But it was clear that they had no leads. They said it was a robbery gone wrong, that it was just a random crime. But David didn't believe that. He had grown up with his mother's lessons in kindness, and he knew that someone like her, someone who had never hurt a soul, didn't just become the victim of a random crime. There had to be more to it. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had wanted her gone. But who? And why? David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something hidden just beneath the surface that no one else saw. His gut told him it wasn't just a random crime. But how could he prove it? He was just a kid. What could he do? As the weeks dragged on, the police arrested someone, a man named Victor Blackwood, a wealthy businessman who had been in the area at the time of the attack. The arrest seemed like a step forward, but David didn't feel any better. There wasn't enough evidence to convict Blackwood. The police said they had found some things that linked him to the crime, but they didn't have enough to charge him with anything concrete. For David, it wasn't enough. Something told him that Blackwood was hiding something, and he would find out what it was, no matter what it took. Weeks passed since the death of David's mother, Sarah, and life seemed to grind to a standstill. The house, once a place filled with laughter and warmth, now felt hollow. David spent his days in a fog, unable to shake the ache in his heart. His grandmother, Marjorie, did her best to take care of him. She made his favorite meals, tucked him in at night, and tried to offer him comfort. But it was never enough. Nothing could fill the hole left by his mother's absence. The police investigation, though thorough, had not made much progress. It was a robbery gone wrong, they said. But David knew deep down that it was more than that. His mother had been a kind, compassionate woman. Why would anyone want to harm her? The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that this was no random act of violence. Someone had wanted her dead, and he was going to find out why. Then, one morning, as David was sitting at the kitchen table, his grandmother entered with a newspaper. Her hands shook as she handed it to him, her face pale. David took the paper and looked at the headline, "Businessman arrested in connection to Sarah Morgan's murder." His heart skipped a beat as he read on. The man who had been arrested was none other than Victor Blackwood, a wealthy and influential businessman who was known for his cold demeanor and his expensive taste. David didn't know much about him, other than that he was someone who moved in circles far removed from his own. But the more he read, the more he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Could it be true? Could this man be responsible for his mother's death? The police had gathered evidence linking Blackwood to the crime scene. They claimed he was in the area the night Sarah was killed, and they had found his fingerprints on the car door. It all seemed like a clear case, a piece of evidence falling into place. But as the weeks went by and the trial began, David started to feel more and more uneasy. Blackwood's defense team was relentless. They argued that the whole thing was a mistake, a tragic accident. They claimed there was no proof that Blackwood had meant to kill Sarah. They said he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, that the robbery had gone awry, and that Blackwood had just been an innocent bystander. The prosecution struggled to counteract these claims, unable to present anything solid enough to refute the defense. Slowly, the case began to unravel, and the public's support for Blackwood grew. David watched the trial every day. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his small body tense, his eyes fixed on the man who had taken everything from him. The more he listened to the defense, the more frustrated he became. They had no solid evidence, no clear motive, and still Blackwood remained calm, his expression unwavering, as if he knew the whole thing would blow over. But David didn't believe it. He couldn't. There had to be something they were missing, something no one else could see. The breakthrough came one evening when David was at his grandmother's house, sitting at the kitchen table. He had been looking through some old photographs of his mother when he found something that made his heart stop. It was a photo of his mother and a man at a hospital charity event. David didn't recognize him at first, but then he saw it. Blackwood. He was standing beside his mother, smiling in a photo that had been taken long before her death. The thought hit David like a ton of bricks. Why was Blackwood at the charity event? What was his connection to Sarah? David's mind raced as he thought about everything that had happened. Blackwood's calm demeanor in court, his lack of emotion, his seemingly perfect alibi. It all felt too convenient. David had always trusted his gut. He had been raised to believe that people's actions spoke louder than words, and his gut told him that Blackwood wasn't just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something more here, something deeper that no one else was seeing. David couldn't let it go. He began to investigate on his own. Every day after school, he would walk to the library, scouring through old newspapers and articles to find anything that might tie Blackwood to his mother, to her death. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something he felt comfortable doing. But David knew he had to do it. The police weren't moving fast enough, and if he didn't take action, no one else would. It was late one night when David stumbled upon something important. He found an article about a local business deal that had gone sour years ago. The article mentioned a dispute between Blackwood and a man named Thomas McCarthy, a local businessman who had been found dead under suspicious circumstances just a few weeks before Sarah's murder. David's heart raced as he read on. McCarthy's death had been ruled a suicide, but something about the whole story felt off. David looked at the dates and connections. McCarthy had been involved in some shady dealings, and there were rumors that Blackwood had a hand in his downfall. David couldn't help but connect the dots. McCarthy's death had been a turning point for Blackwood, and now Sarah Morgan was dead. It was all too much to ignore. David knew there was a connection between the two deaths, and Blackwood was at the center of it. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, his thoughts racing as he thought about everything he had uncovered. He knew that Blackwood had to be guilty, but the evidence wasn't enough. There had to be something more, something that would bring this all to light. The next day, as David sat in court again, he watched Blackwood carefully. The man seemed so calm, so collected. It was as if he didn't care that his world was crumbling. He watched the trial continue, the defense team making their arguments, but David's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about McCarthy, about how Blackwood had likely been involved in something bigger than anyone realized. And as he sat there, a sense of dread crept over him. He was close to something. He could feel it. But what if he was wrong? What if the truth was darker than he could even imagine? David had no idea how much danger he was in. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. The days blurred together as the trial dragged on. David sat in the same seat every day, his eyes fixed on the courtroom, his heart pounding with every word. The defense was relentless, and it seemed as though they were winning. The evidence was being chipped away, piece by piece. The prosecution struggled to hold their ground. There were moments when David felt like everything was slipping away, like the truth was too far out of reach. But there was something inside him, something his mother had taught him, that refused to give up. No matter how difficult, no matter how small the chance, he knew he had to keep fighting. He couldn't let Blackwood go free. David began spending more time at his grandmother's house after school, poring through his mother's belongings, looking for anything that might give him an edge. It wasn't easy. The pain of losing her still felt fresh, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Yet, he pressed on, knowing that the answers were out there, waiting to be discovered. One night, as he was searching through some of his mother's old files, David found something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a letter or a photograph like he had hoped for, but a small, unmarked envelope tucked at the back of a drawer. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, but it wasn't what was written on it that caught his attention. It was the name at the bottom, Victor Blackwood. David froze. His hands trembled as he read the letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a note scribbled in a hurried, almost frantic handwriting. The content was brief, but it was chilling. The letter detailed a meeting between his mother and Victor Blackwood a few days before her death. David couldn't make sense of it at first, but as he read, he realized that the letter mentioned a deal, an agreement of sorts, between Blackwood and his mother. They had met about something that had troubled his mother, something important. "Sarah," the letter said, "you need to drop the case. You know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I will make sure the consequences are dire for you and your son." David's stomach turned. The letter was a threat, a warning. Blackwood had threatened his mother. He had threatened them both. David's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. His mother had always been a kind, honest woman. She never got involved in anything shady or dangerous. But this letter, told him that there was something much bigger at play, something that Blackwood was involved in. And the idea of a threat from someone like him, someone with so much power, sent a chill down David's spine. It had been a subtle warning. His mother had likely ignored it, brushing it off as an empty threat. But now, it made sense. The more David thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. Blackwood had been trying to silence his mother for a reason, and it wasn't just because of a random robbery. There was something she had uncovered, something important. And whatever it was, Blackwood would stop at nothing to make sure it stayed buried. The discovery of the letter felt like a turning point. David's hands were clammy as he carefully folded it back into the envelope, his mind racing. He needed to show someone, but who could he trust? The police had already investigated Blackwood, and the trial was dragging on with no real progress. David didn't know if he could rely on the justice system. It seemed like everything was moving too slowly, too cautiously. He thought of his grandmother. Marjorie had been the one person who had stood by him through all of this, the one who had tried to keep him safe. But even she couldn't help him with this. No, David realized, this was something only he could fix. He had to find a way to prove that Blackwood wasn't just an innocent businessman caught up in a tragic accident. Blackwood was the mastermind behind something much bigger. That night, after tucking his grandmother into bed, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the letter, about the threat. He knew what he had to do. It was time to confront the evidence head on. But how? The next morning, as David sat at the breakfast table, Something caught his eye. His grandmother had left the file on Sarah's desk, an old hospital folder that his mother had been working on before her death. David had never thought to look through it before, but now, with the letter fresh in his mind, he couldn't help but feel like there might be something more hidden inside. With shaking hands, David opened the folder. Inside, he found a list of names. Several of them were familiar: doctors, colleagues, people his mother had worked with. But then, at the bottom of the list, David saw something that made his heart stop. There was a name he recognized: Thomas McCarthy. The same name he had seen in the article weeks ago. The same man whose death had been labeled a suicide. But why was McCarthy's name on his mother's file? David's head swam as he pieced the connections together. Thomas McCarthy was involved with Blackwood. And according to the letter, his mother had been investigating something about McCarthy's death. It wasn't just a random suicide. It was part of something more sinister, something that Blackwood had tried to bury. David's heart raced as he realized the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about his mother's death anymore. This was about exposing a conspiracy that could destroy everything. McCarthy's death had been a warning, and Blackwood had used it to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Now, David had to be the one to expose it. With the letter and the new evidence, David felt a surge of determination. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't enough to just have this information. He had to make sure it reached the right people. That afternoon, David made his way to the police station, the letter and folder clutched tightly in his hands. His grandmother tried to stop him, worried that he might be walking into danger. But David knew that if he didn't act now, nothing would ever change. He walked up to the front desk, his hands sweating with nerves, and asked to speak with Detective Miller, the lead investigator on his mother's case. The officer at the desk looked at him strangely, but David didn't back down. He had to do this. When Detective Miller walked into the room and saw David, his eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing here, kid?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. "I have something," David said, his voice steady. "Something that proves Victor Blackwood is guilty." David handed the detective the letter and the file, watching as Miller's eyes widened as he read the contents. The detective didn't speak for several moments, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up at David, his expression grave. "This changes everything," he said quietly. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. David couldn't quite believe what he had done. He had gone straight to the police with his findings, pushing the investigation forward in a way that no one had expected. Detective Miller had taken the letter and the file seriously, and though David was still just a kid, he could see the weight of the moment in the detective's eyes. This was real. This was finally the breakthrough they needed to start unraveling the truth. The police had promised to follow up on the leads in the file, particularly the connection between Blackwood and Thomas McCarthy. Detective Miller told David he would do everything he could to get to the bottom of the case. But there was something else, something in Miller's tone that made David uneasy. The detective didn't say it outright, but it was clear. They were walking on dangerous ground now. Blackwood wasn't just a businessman with a temper. He was a man with power, a man who had resources at his disposal, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The threat had been clear from the very beginning. Blackwood had threatened David's mother before. That was something David had learned from the letter. He had tried to silence her, and now David was in his crosshairs. David didn't fully understand the danger at first. To him, it seemed like a simple matter of getting justice for his mother. He had the evidence, the truth, and now he just needed the law to work in his favor. But the world wasn't that simple. it wasn't that clean. That night, when David and his grandmother were sitting down to dinner, things took a turn for the worse. As they ate, there was a sudden, sharp knock on the door. David's heart skipped a beat as he looked up at his grandmother. She stood up slowly, her face pale. "I'll get it," she said, trying to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her. David didn't move as she opened the door. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Then, his grandmother's voice broke the silence. "Oh my God," she whispered. David's breath caught in his throat. He stood up quickly, rushing toward the door. He couldn't see anyone outside, but he could see his grandmother holding a small, folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. "Grandma?" David asked, his voice tight. "What is it?" She turned slowly, the color drained from her face. "It's a note," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's stomach twisted as she handed it to him. He unfolded it carefully, his hands shaking as he read the short, chilling message. "Drop the case, or else." David's mind went blank for a moment. He stared at the words, trying to understand them. But there was no mistaking the threat. Someone, most likely someone connected to Blackwood, had been watching them. They knew what David was doing, and they wanted him to stop. His grandmother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, but David could feel her fear, too. This wasn't just a random act. It was a warning, a direct message. They had crossed a line, and now they were being told to back off. David felt a sudden wave of dread wash over him, but at the same time, something inside him hardened. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He couldn't. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about justice, and about exposing the truth. He wasn't afraid of a piece of paper, no matter how threatening. But he knew that the threats would only get worse from here. "Who would do this?" his grandmother asked, her voice shaking. "David, we need to be careful. We need to be smart." David nodded, but he wasn't going to back down. He knew the danger was real, but he also knew that he couldn't let Blackwood continue to get away with what he had done. He had to finish what he started. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew. David could feel it, like a constant, heavy weight pressing on his chest. The police hadn't found anything that would lead them directly to Blackwood yet, but David knew they were getting closer. Detective Miller had been working tirelessly, and David's information had given them something solid to follow. But even though the investigation was progressing, the threats were only getting more frequent. One morning, as David was walking to school, he noticed something strange. His mother's car, which had been parked in the driveway for weeks now, looked different. The windows were covered in fingerprints, the kind that could only have been left by someone deliberately searching through the vehicle. It was as if someone had gone through every inch of it, trying to find something. David's stomach turned as he realized the intruder was looking for the same things he was: any evidence that could link Blackwood to his mother's murder. David felt a cold chill run down his spine. It was no longer a matter of him searching for answers. Someone else was searching for them, too. And the closer they got, the more dangerous things would become. That afternoon, as David returned home, the phone rang. His grandmother answered it, her voice low, her words clipped. David watched her face pale as she listened. She hung up the phone slowly, her expression full of worry. "That was the police," she said quietly. "They found something." David's heart raced as he sat down. What did they find? His grandmother didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought for a moment, then finally spoke. "They found surveillance footage of the parking lot where your mother was attacked. They think they might have seen something important." something that can tie Blackwood to the crime. David's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This could be the evidence they needed to finally arrest Blackwood. But as the realization dawned on him, something else tugged at his mind. The more evidence they uncovered, the more dangerous it would become. Blackwood had already sent one warning. What would happen when they found more? That night, as David lay in bed, unable to sleep, his mind raced. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. They were on the brink of something big, something that could change everything. But he also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. The threats had already started, and they weren't going to stop until Blackwood got what he wanted. David rolled over in bed, his heart still pounding in his chest. No matter what happened, no matter how dangerous it got, he wasn't going to back down. He was going to find the truth, whatever it took. The tension in the Morgan household had reached an all-time high. The phone calls from the police had become more frequent, but with each passing day, it seemed like they were no closer to finding the crucial evidence they needed to bring Victor Blackwood to justice. Despite everything David had uncovered, they were still missing the one thing that could tie Blackwood directly to his mother's death. A confession, a solid link, something undeniable. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The threats had escalated. His grandmother had insisted on taking precautions, locking all the windows at night, installing extra security cameras, and even hiring a private security guard for a while. But nothing made David feel safe. Every time he went to bed, every time he walked out the door, the feeling of danger lingered in the back of his mind. The worst part was that David couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of helplessness. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a grown-up with years of experience in handling situations like this. He was just a kid, 8 years old, who had already lost his mother and was now being forced to navigate a dangerous world of corruption and lies. But David was determined. He couldn't stop. Not now. One evening, when David returned home after school, he noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. His grandmother had a habit of double-checking everything before leaving the house, but today it seemed different. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside, calling out softly, "Grandma?" His voice echoed eerily through the empty hallway. There was no response. His heart began to race as he moved cautiously through the house. He paused at the living room, but it was empty. Everything looked just as it should. Nothing seemed out of place. Until he reached the kitchen. The back door was wide open. David's throat tightened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He moved toward the door, peeking out cautiously into the yard. There was nothing there. But then, as he turned around, he froze. The kitchen was a mess. It wasn't just a little disorganized. It looked like someone had been searching through the cupboards, rifling through drawers. David's mind raced. The only thing that made sense was that someone had broken in, looking for something. His heart pounded. They were looking for the evidence. His mother's file, the letter, the photographs, the proof of Blackwood's involvement. Everything David had found was stored in the drawer, tucked away, hidden from the world. And now it seemed that someone was desperate enough to break into his house to find it. Panic surged through David as he ran through the house, his thoughts spinning. Where was his grandmother? Had she seen the intruder? Was she okay? "Grandma," David called out, his voice trembling now. Just as he was about to turn back toward the front door, he heard a soft rustling sound from the living room. His heart stopped. He tiptoed toward the sound, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As he peeked around the corner, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing by the front window, was a tall man. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a mask. David didn't know who the man was, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just a random break-in. This man was here for the evidence. He was here because someone, most likely Blackwood, was willing to go to any lengths to keep the truth buried. David felt a wave of fear wash over him. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to call for help. But there was no time. The man was already starting to move toward the back of the house, likely to search for more clues. David's heart raced as he quickly ducked behind the couch, hoping to stay out of sight. His hands shook as he tried to steady his breath. He had to think. He had to do something. The man was close now, and David knew he couldn't let him find what was hidden in the kitchen. If the man got his hands on the evidence, it would be all over. His eyes darted around the room. That's when he saw it. The small kitchen knife his grandmother kept in the drawer. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He quickly moved toward the kitchen, trying to stay as quiet as possible. David reached the drawer and grabbed the knife, his small fingers trembling as he held it in his hand. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't be afraid now. He had to protect the truth. He had to protect the memory of his mother. Before he could turn around, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, the knife raised, but it was too late. The man was there. David's heart skipped a beat, and he froze for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The man, seeing the knife in David's hand, raised his own hand, stepping forward slowly, as though sizing David up. "What are you doing here?" the man growled, his voice low and cold. David swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not scared of you." The man laughed, a cruel sound that sent chills down David's spine. "You should be, kid," he said, stepping closer. "You've gotten in the way of things you don't understand." Before David could react, the man lunged toward him. His heart pounded as he took a step back, just in time to avoid being grabbed. David's mind raced. He had to escape. But how? Just as the man reached for him, David's grandmother's voice rang out from the other room. "David!" she shouted, her voice full of panic. The intruder froze, his head snapping toward the sound of her voice. It was all David needed. In a flash, he ran for the door, sprinting out into the yard. He heard the man curse behind him, but he didn't stop. His legs burned as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. David burst into the street, still clutching the knife in his hand. He didn't know what to do, but he couldn't stay there. He had to get help. And then, as if the world were conspiring against him, he saw a familiar figure at the end of the street. Detective Miller. David rushed toward him, not stopping to think, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Detective! He's in my house! He's looking for the evidence! We have to stop him!" David shouted, his voice trembling. Miller's eyes widened as he saw the panic in David's eyes. Without saying another word, he reached for his phone, calling for backup. "Stay with me, kid," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. David nodded, still trying to catch his breath. He had done it. He had found the courage to act. And now he hoped that it wouldn't be too late. The next few hours were a blur of flashing police lights and frantic activity. Detective Miller had called for backup as soon as David had alerted him about the intruder. The officers arrived swiftly, securing the area around the Morgan household. By the time David's grandmother, Marjorie, was safely taken to the police car, David was already pacing, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. He couldn't believe it. The man who had broken into their house was clearly sent by someone with a powerful interest in keeping the truth hidden. The realization hit David like a brick. There was no doubt now Blackwood had been trying to silence them for good. David sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, his eyes fixed on the flashing lights outside the window. He was still shaken from the confrontation, but his resolve remained firm. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to exposing Blackwood for what he truly was. No, David knew that this was just the beginning. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. After what felt like an eternity, Detective Miller approached the car, his face grave. He opened the door and sat beside David, his eyes full of concern. "David, I'm glad you're okay," Miller said, his voice soft. "We've got the place locked down, but we still don't know who was behind that break-in. We need to talk to your grandmother about what she saw, but right now, I need you to stay with me. Things are escalating quickly." David nodded, his hands clenching in his lap. "What's going to happen now? Will they arrest him?" "We're working on it," Miller said, his tone serious. "But right now, we need to be sure we have enough to charge Blackwood. He has a lot of influence, and he's already done everything he can to cover his tracks. We have to be careful." David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He understood what the detective was saying. This wasn't just about proving Blackwood's guilt. It was about surviving long enough to get the truth out. Hours passed, and the police continued their investigation. It wasn't until late in the evening that Miller approached David again, his expression a mix of determination and urgency. "We've got something," Miller said, his voice low. "We've located the surveillance footage. It's clear. Blackwood was at the scene the night your mother was attacked. He's been lying this whole time." David's heart raced. He had known it all along. He had known that Blackwood was involved, but to hear it from the police, to hear that they finally had the proof, made everything feel real. The case was no longer just a game of speculation. The truth was out there. They had Blackwood. "I need to see it," David said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We need to show the judge. We can't let him get away with it." Miller paused, looking at David for a long moment. "You're sure you're ready for this, David? It's not going to be easy. This footage, this is going to change everything. It's going to make Blackwood even more dangerous." David took a deep breath. "I'm ready. I have to do this. For my mom." Miller nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "Okay then, let's go." The two of them drove to the police station, where the footage had been retrieved from the hospital's security system. As they walked into the viewing room, the room felt cold, sterile, and too quiet. David sat down, his hands trembling, but he forced himself to focus. Miller motioned to the monitor, and with a single press of a button, the video began to play. David's stomach churned as he saw his mother's car, parked in the dimly lit parking lot, just like it had been on that fateful night. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. David could see his mother walking toward her car, looking over her shoulder, likely sensing something was wrong. And then the man appeared. It was Blackwood. David's breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. Blackwood approached his mother, pulling something from his jacket. A knife. The footage showed his mother's face, startled and confused, before she backed away. The camera angle shifted as the struggle began, but David could clearly see his mother fighting back, trying to protect herself. She had always been strong, always tried to help others, but she was no match for Blackwood's violence. David watched, horrified, as Blackwood lunged at her, grabbing her and stabbing her. His mother's screams were muffled by the camera's poor audio quality, but the images were enough. The truth was undeniable. Blackwood had killed her. David felt a surge of anger and grief wash over him. His mother, the kindest, most selfless person he had ever known, had been taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable. He clenched his fists tightly as the footage ended. There was no denying it now. The man who had been so calm, so confident, was a monster. He had taken everything from David, and now it was time to make sure he faced the consequences. Miller watched David carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is it, David. We've got him. We're taking this footage to the judge tomorrow. This is the proof we needed." David nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. It wasn't over yet, but it was close. The trial was about to shift in their favor. Blackwood's lies were unraveling. The truth was finally coming to light. But as David prepared to leave the station, he had a gut feeling that told him the worst was yet to come. Blackwood wasn't going down without a fight. And now, with the final evidence in their hands, David knew they were entering a new phase of the battle, one that would require all of his strength, all of his courage. As they left the station, David couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwood was planning something to stop them before the case went public. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. They had to act fast. David's thoughts raced as they drove back to his grandmother's house. He wasn't sure what was coming, but one thing was clear. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, David could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Today was the day the truth would finally be exposed, and Victor Blackwood would face justice for what he had done to his mother. But as he sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the cold coffee in front of him, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Something about the day felt off. His grandmother, Marjorie, had already gone to bed exhausted from the stress of the past few days, and David had stayed up late the night before, reviewing the evidence once again, making sure he was ready for the final step. But now, in the quiet of the morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwood, who had always seemed so calm, so in control, wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. And David knew that the fight was going to get much more dangerous. The footage, the letter, the evidence, they were all in the hands of the police now. It was only a matter of time before the judge saw everything. But David wasn't naive. He knew that Blackwood had people working for him, people who would do anything to protect him. The powerful businessman was not someone who would go quietly into the night. As David walked with Detective Miller into the courthouse later that day, he noticed the buzz of reporters, the flashing lights, and the crowd gathered outside. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the verdict. And David knew that once the trial was over, nothing would ever be the same. This case would change everything. They entered the courthouse, and David was led into the courtroom, where the judge was already seated, his gavel raised, signaling the start of proceedings. Blackwood was already in the defendant's chair, his usual smug expression now gone. He looked pale, tense, as though he knew that today would be the day everything fell apart. His high-priced lawyers stood beside him, whispering to each other urgently, trying to figure out a way to salvage what little hope they had left. David's heart raced as he took his seat in the witness box. He was ready for this. He had been prepared for weeks. But now, sitting there, with everyone's eyes on him, the reality of the situation hit him all at once. It was happening. He was about to face the man who had taken everything from him. The judge cleared his throat and spoke, his voice echoing through the room. "David Morgan, you've come forward with evidence that has shaken the foundation of this trial. Your courage in doing so is commendable. Now, we must hear your testimony. Please tell the court what you know." David nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. He looked directly at Blackwood, whose gaze met his, cold and unyielding. Blackwood's face was expressionless, but David could see the underlying tension in his eyes. For the first time, Blackwood didn't look like the confident businessman who thought he could buy his way out of anything. He looked vulnerable, and for a brief moment, David felt a flicker of hope. This was it. Blackwood was on the verge of losing everything. David took a deep breath and began. "I know what happened to my mother," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Victor Blackwood killed her, and I have proof." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and the defense team sprang into action, trying to interrupt David's statement. But the judge silenced them with a swift motion. "Continue, Mr. Morgan," the judge said, his tone firm. David's eyes never left Blackwood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, the one that had been addressed to his mother, the one that had proven Blackwood's threat. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is a letter my mother received from Victor Blackwood a few days before she died. It's a threat. He told her to drop the case, or else. This letter was written by him." Blackwood's face twisted in anger as he shot a look at his attorneys, but he didn't say anything. His expression said it all. He was terrified. The truth was finally coming to light, and he couldn't stop it. David turned to the judge. "I also found something else. The surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot where my mother was attacked. In the footage, you can see Blackwood. You can see him approaching her and then attacking her." David's heart raced as he watched the reactions of the jury, the judge, and everyone in the room. There was no denying it anymore. Blackwood's guilt was undeniable. David had done it. He had exposed the truth, and the weight of the moment filled him with a strange sense of relief. But that relief was fleeting, because David knew that even with the evidence, Blackwood wasn't going to go down quietly. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a crash, from the back of the courtroom. David whipped his head around, his eyes wide in shock. The doors flew open, and two men barged in, pushing past the officers and security. They were armed, their faces masked. A chill ran down David's spine. Blackwood's men. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People screamed and ducked as the armed men made their way toward the front, pushing past everyone in their way. David froze. His grandmother, sitting in the back row, screamed in terror as one of the intruders lunged toward her. David's mind raced. He couldn't let them hurt anyone else. He couldn't let Blackwood win. His mother had fought for what was right, and now it was his turn to do the same. Before anyone could react, David's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and hurled it toward one of the men, knocking him off balance. The man staggered back, and the other one turned, momentarily distracted. "Get down!" Detective Miller shouted, pulling David behind the witness stand for cover. David's heart was racing, but he didn't freeze. He couldn't. He had to be brave. The officers scrambled to react, drawing their weapons, but Blackwood's men were quick, dangerous, and determined. The chaos was overwhelming, but amidst the shouting and confusion, David saw his chance. As one of the intruders moved closer to his grandmother, David lunged, grabbing a fallen officer's baton. With all his might, he swung it at the man, knocking him to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers as more officers flooded into the room, restraining the attackers. It was over. The men were cuffed and hauled away, their mission thwarted. But David's heart was still pounding, and his mind was racing. The judge stood up, his voice stern. "This court will reconvene after a brief recess. We will not allow violence to overshadow justice. Mr. Morgan, you have done more than anyone could have imagined." David's eyes met Blackwood's one last time. This time, there was no smugness, no confidence. Blackwood's face was pale, his eyes filled with fear. It was over for him. David had won. For his mother. For justice. For the truth. The days following the courtroom confrontation were a blur for David. The trial continued, but it was now just a formality. With Blackwood's involvement in his mother's death exposed, the case was clear. The surveillance footage, the letter, and the testimony had sealed his fate. The defense could no longer fight the overwhelming evidence. Blackwood's empire of lies had crumbled. David sat quietly in his grandmother's house, staring out the window at the cloudy sky. It had been a week since the attack in the courtroom, a week since the police arrested Blackwood's men. His grandmother had insisted that they leave town for a while, to stay with family in a nearby city, to avoid the press and the public eye. The world had learned the truth, but that truth had come at a cost. David was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had fought so hard for justice, but now, with everything coming to an end, he felt strangely empty. The victory didn't feel as sweet as he had imagined. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" his grandmother asked, her voice gentle as she sat next to him on the couch. She had been watching him closely, knowing how much the past few weeks had weighed on him. David nodded, but the emptiness inside him was still there. "I don't know," he whispered. "It doesn't feel right. Mom's still gone, and it hurts so much." Marjorie reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly. "I know, darling. It's going to take time. But what you've done, what you've accomplished, it's more than anyone could have hoped for. Your mom would be so proud of you." David looked at her, the tears welling up in his eyes. His grandmother's words were a balm to his wounded soul, but no amount of praise could bring back his mother. She was gone, and nothing could change that. And yet, in some way, her teachings, her strength, her kindness had led him here. He had done what he could to honor her memory, to fight for the truth. The victory wasn't just his. It belonged to his mother, too. She had taught him the power of courage, of standing up for what's right, and David had used that power to see justice done. The police had informed them that Blackwood was facing life in prison. The evidence was irrefutable, and the case against him was so strong that there was no chance of appeal. The authorities had already begun investigating his past dealings, the ones tied to Thomas McCarthy and other mysterious events that seemed to lead back to Blackwood's web of corruption. It wasn't just Sarah Morgan who had suffered. There were countless others. But now, Blackwood's empire was unraveling, and he would answer for everything he had done. David felt a pang of satisfaction at the thought, but it was fleeting. It didn't fill the hole in his heart. He had done what he set out to do, but the loss of his mother was still too raw. The pain was still there, lingering like a shadow over every day. As the weeks passed, life began to return to some semblance of normal. The media frenzy around the trial died down, and David and his grandmother settled back into a routine. They didn't talk about the case much anymore. Instead, they focused on healing, on moving forward, one step at a time. David didn't go back to school right away. He couldn't. He needed time. But in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to think about the future, he started to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He could see a future for himself again, a life where he would carry his mother's legacy with him. He had been the one to bring the truth to light, the one to make sure she hadn't been forgotten. His mother had taught him that kindness was powerful, but courage was even more so. One afternoon, as David sat in his mother's room, flipping through old photo albums, he came across a picture of Sarah when she was younger. She was smiling in a field of flowers, holding a small bouquet in her hand. It was the kind of picture that made David smile, even through the tears. He held the photo tightly in his hands, his mind replaying all the memories of his mother, the stories she had told him, the lessons she had instilled in him. "Mom," he whispered softly, looking at the picture, "I did it. I did what you taught me to do. I fought for the truth. I made sure you weren't forgotten." He sat there for a long time, letting the tears fall freely. But these weren't tears of despair. These were tears of release. He had done everything he could to honor his mother's memory. Now, he had to live the life she had taught him to live. A life full of kindness, but also full of courage. Later that afternoon, Detective Miller came to visit. He had been one of the few people who had supported David from the beginning, who had believed in him even when the odds were stacked against them. David stood up to greet him, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "I just wanted to check in on you, kid," Miller said, his voice gruff but warm. "How are you holding up?" David smiled faintly. "I'm okay," he said, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but I'm okay." Miller nodded, his expression softening. "You did something that most adults couldn't have done, David. You got justice for your mom. You helped bring down one of the most powerful men in the city. You're stronger than you realize." David looked up at him, feeling the weight of Miller's words. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. Miller shook his head. "You did it on your own, kid. You were the one who had the courage to stand up and say the truth. That's not something that comes easily." David felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the bittersweet reality that his mother was still gone. "I did what she would have wanted. I couldn't let him get away with it. Not after everything she did for me." "You did her proud," Miller said with a smile. "She would be proud of you." David nodded, his throat tight. "I just want to make sure that no one forgets her, what she did, who she was." The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. But in that silence, David found something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't complete. He knew he would always miss his mother, always carry that grief with him. But he also knew that he had done everything he could to honor her. As Miller left, David went back to the photo album. He picked up another picture, this one of him and his mother on her birthday, laughing together as they sat on the porch. He smiled softly, running his fingers over the image. "I'll never forget you, Mom," he whispered. "I promise." And in that moment, David realized that his journey wasn't over. The fight for justice might have ended, but the journey to heal, to live the life his mother had wanted for him, had just begun.